Rain had started as a whisper, and by the time the alley breathed, it felt like the city was rinsing itself clean. Neon painted the wet bricks in bruised blues and sickly pinks. Footsteps echoed twice and died. A woman's muffled cry cut through the night, sharp and small against the concrete. Someone swore. A bag hit the ground. The sound of a struggle, sudden and close, made the world shudder. Michael moved before he thought. He didn't think of cameras or consequences. He thought of his daughter's small hands reaching for him in the dark, of a name whispered in a dim hospital room years ago, and a promise he had kept until every breath cost him something else. He stepped into the alley like someone returning to an old body that still remembered how to move. He took control in a handful of motions, no theatrics, no flourish. Hands on an attacker's wrist, a lever of weight, an elbow to the ribs that shifted momentum. He used what was at hand, a broken pen with a faint eagle engraved on the barrel, the stub of a board he pried loose from a rain-soaked pallet, the tilt of a stranger's shoulder to turn two bodies away from a woman who couldn't fight back. He did not swing to hurt. He moved to stop harm. A phone camera rose, voices layered over each other. Somebody shouted, "Did you see that? He's crazy." Another voice laughed and said, "Looks like a drunk hero." The woman Michael had pulled out of the shove scrubbed her hair back with trembling fingers, breath coming in staccato sobs. She kept saying, "My sister, she's fine." Her words were a thread that held the moment together. When it was over, Michael let the crowd's judgment land. He stepped back into the rain and into anonymity. He wiped his palms on his coat and kept his head down. He was breathing heavily. The adrenaline was sour and familiar. A boy's face flashed in his mind. Emily, 8, asleep in a narrow bed framed by sun-faded curtains. He had a habit of counting small things to stay steady. The dent in his kettle, the yellow crayon drawing taped to the fridge, the way the light fell through their one living-room window at morning. Tonight, he added salt to that list, the sound of a woman no longer being dragged. Earlier that morning, long before the alley opened like a wound, he had stood at a bakery window and asked a question that would later be writ large as a headline. He had sounded like a man who had been brushed by luck and left with the stains. He looked older than his years. His coat carried last week's rain. His hair was frizzed from a day's sweat in traffic, and a thinness around his jaw suggested missed dinners and overtime that hadn't come through. "Any day-old bread for my son?" he had asked the clerk, voice low enough that the woman behind him at the counter frowned and gave him a sympathetic look. The clerk hesitated, then slid a paper-wrapped crust across the counter, as if it had been the only option. Michael had taken it with the clumsy grace of someone unused to charity. Small thanks, a small smile, a nod like a prayer. That line, simple, brittle, honest, would be picked up and turned into a story by noon. People love shorthand. They love to point, label, and move on. The bread, held in one damp hand, would become a photograph people used to explain who he was. It would do double duty, proof of need and proof of oddity. At home, the apartment had the tired warmth of a place held together on purpose. The radiator hissed like a steady heart. Emily drew horses with crooked legs and solid smiles, and Michael told her every night that the horses were brave. He had chosen this, traded a career that had put food and security on the table for him and his family for something quieter, safer, more ordinary. He had wanted Emily to grow up knowing stumbles and scraped knees and the smell of pancakes on Saturday, not the clang of a weapons locker or the hush that comes with orders given in basements. Sarah's ghost lived in their life the way seasons live in a house. She was in Emily's laugh and in the empty side of the bed. Michael kept a broken pen with an eagle engraved along its side in the pocket of his coat like a talisman. It was not a relic of pride. It was a reminder of a life shelved for love. He had been working this morning, odd jobs, a shift that had waited for months to pay, roofing in a drizzle that puddled like a bad memory. The money was thin, the hours thinner. He needed the crust for Emily's lunch. It was humility and necessity braided together. He was not homeless in the bureaucratic sense, but he was worn thin enough that a stranger could mistake the surface for the whole story. If this is speaking to you, stay with us, subscribe, and share. He wondered later whether that tiny, offhand plea from a narrator on a video would have any weight in the world where grocery counters make headlines. It felt wrong to think about attention when the night's rhythm had been simply to move. The video from the alley settled into the city's bloodstream by sunrise. The clip was short, 42 seconds of dripping rain and Michael's movement. The title someone invented said something sharp: "Drunk man attacks attackers." In the comment strings, people made clever cruelty their second job. Some people called him homeless, others called him drama, a few called him hero, and the argument tasted like vinegar on everyone's breath. Michael sat on the edge of their couch and watched the replies stack into a wall. He had always been cautious of attention. Attention is a thin thing that takes more than it gives. He watched, waited, and listened as strangers made their verdict. Most of the comments judged his face first: his beard stubble, the coat frayed at the cuff, a smear of grease on his thumb. Nobody saw his reasons. Nobody, for the most part, saw his daughter. Emily woke when he came in. She was small and serious in the morning light, hair tangled from a pillow that never quite fit her head right. She counted the minutes to school with a solemnity that made him laugh. He wrapped the crust in wax paper and put it in her thermos with a love note he had written in a shaky hand: "Dad loves you. Eat slow." She kissed the note and shoved it in her backpack. She called him the best daddy for making soup, and Michael felt like the richest man in the world for 5 seconds. The day spun toward night, and the night had its own dangers. He prayed, not to a God spoken aloud necessarily, but to the idea of staying small and unseen. He had rules: don't get involved unless the line was crossed, avoid cameras, shrink into the crowd. But a shriek has a way of cutting through rules. The woman's hand going slack in the rain was a line crossed, and the part of him that had been taught to move toward danger switched on like an old fuse. In the aftermath, the world smeared him with labels. Clips multiplied: homeless man attacks bikers, oddball fights city toughs. The posts trolled his life and his breathing. Memes used his coat as a prop to mock. The cruelty of strangers glanced away from the actual violence the woman had endured and fixed on him instead. Some commenters ridiculed his broken pen as if an unfinished office supply was a moral failing. Others dissected his face, his weight, his gait. Michael read nothing that evening. He held his phone like it might decide for him who he was. Emily climbed into his lap and handed him another drawing. This one had 2 stick figures and a big sun with 5 little hearts clustered in the corner. "Daddy, don't be scary on TV," she said, voice widening in the way only small children can when they try to understand the strange world of screens. He tried to explain, but how do you tell a child that strangers on the internet can be both blind and sharp? He kissed the top of her head and promised her pancakes on Saturday. He went to bed with the pen in his pocket and the taste of rain still in his mouth. The next morning, someone knocked on their apartment door with the kind of insistence that suggested money behind it. Michael opened it to a woman in a coat clean enough to be a uniform of another life, tailored, ironed, a color that suggested a brand. She had the look of someone who was used to doors opening at her knock. Her eyes were dry and tired, the way grief makes you old in a day, then younger again when you find something to do with the pain. Her name was Isabella Lane. She did not come as a judge. She came as someone who had been raw and terrified, and now needed to thank the hand that had steadied her sister's life. She recognized Michael, not by his coat, but by a small detail that even he had forgotten could be read: the engraved eagle on the side of his broken pen. When she lifted the pen in the doorway, the iron announcement of who he had been folded out of his pocket and into the room.
"Where did you get this?" she asked, not accusatory, but curious. He told her he had carried it for many years. It was all he had left from that time. Her voice softened. Her eyes filled. "You were on the team," she said. The words were not a title so much as a map that connected dots: elite security, a past arrangement of danger, a life that had once been all movement and secrets. Michael's face did not change. He had built a life around being ordinary, and now someone had read him as something else entirely. Isabella's sister Sophie was recovering in a nearby hospital. She walked in with the slow attention of someone afraid of causing pain by moving too quickly. When Sophie saw Emily, a small, amazed smile tucked into her features like a break in a cloud. The girls gravitated toward each other in a way that made grown-up arrangements soft and easy. They drew hearts. They compared golden fish in a magazine. Sophie giggled at a nonsense joke Emily made, and the sound was like a small weapon turned toward all the hurt it had absorbed. Isabella's gratitude did not remain private. She carried power the way some people carry a wallet, useful, heavy, capable. She was used to being heard. She called a press conference because she wanted to fold the truth into the public story and stitch it where it had been torn. She stood in front of microphones and cameras and named the man they had already labeled. "You did what you do because you couldn't turn away," she said. "He is not a homeless man seeking attention. He was a security specialist who left that life to raise his daughter. He chose family over the work we all thought to find him." The press framed it in spiky phrases. She used the pen as proof, the small engraving evidence a life that had been given up. Isabella told them Sophie had been the woman dragged in the alley, that Michael had saved her, not because he wanted to be seen, but because he had been trained to move toward danger, and because he had a long memory of what it was like to lose someone you love. Public opinion turned like a crowd on a dime. The same people who had mocked his coat now called him brave. Those who had made jokes deleted their posts or apologized. Viral threads that had smeared him were replaced with long, grateful testimonials. People sent offers of help, small ones, large ones. There were invitations to interviews and offers from community organizers who wanted to honor him. A local volunteer group set up a GoFundMe that raised more in a day than his month of work normally yielded. But beneath the applause there was a quieter currency, respect. A woman on a city council called him a guardian. People who had known him in the neighborhood, shopkeepers, the man who repaired their washing machine, a woman who had served Michael coffee on slow mornings, told stories that were not new to them. They said he was steady.
He had been there, they said, when roofs leaked and kids needed tutoring, and when Sarah had her funeral. The narrative adjusted, folding new elements into public memory. Isabella came back to their apartment with Sophie in tow. The first meeting was awkward and bright. Sophie watched Emily with a fascination that hid grief. Emily, who had known loss in a kid-shaped way, made a point to treat Sophie like she had all the time in the world. She offered a strawberry from her lunch, showed off a drawing, named Emily's 2 favorite horses. Michael watched from the kitchen doorway. He had learned to monitor his face, to keep his joy small enough not to be used. Sophie insisted on making a small gift. She took a new pen from a small leather case and handed it to Michael with a clumsy thanks. "It's not yours," she said, "but it's something until you decide what you need." He took the pen like a man who had been given a map that still needed to be read. Isabella's offer came later, practical and precise. She wanted him to run security for a small private foundation she was building, something that would allow him the kind of hours he said he wanted, and the kind of pay that would stop the thin scraping of survival. It was flexible, with a focus on community initiatives and a contingency for family time. It was not a glamorous position, it was a hand held out with dignity. Michael hesitated, not because the salary wasn't enough or the title too small, but because he had a principle shaped in the steady light of his daughter's laugh. He wanted Emily to grow up ordinary. He feared that taking a job that reclaimed his past might drag them back into a life of secrecy and noise. He had already traded one kind of danger for another kind of exposure. He did not want to swap one unknown for another that might fracture the fragile peace he'd built. He thought about the bread in Emily Spermus and how that honest ask had become a headline. He thought about the pen with its eagle softened by time and the way Isabella had read it like an old language. He balanced the practical against the philosophical, security versus simplicity, recognition versus invisibility. There was never a single lightning moment of decision, just a quiet evening where the two of them sat at their small table, a single bowl of humming, and he watched Emily draw. She drew a house with 2 stories and many flowers. She wrote their names inside it in crooked letters. Michael looked at the house and then at his daughter and knew which way a responsible love leaned. He accepted Isabella's offer, not with a grand speech, but with a series of small, solid choices. He returned the new pen to Sophie with a private joke about not letting her keep it forever. He declined interviews that would have turned Emily into a visible prize.
He took the job with a clause that allowed him to be present for school concerts and to keep weekends free.
He made arrangements with Isabella that felt sensible and wary in equal measure. She promised discretion. She promised to protect the family. For the first time in years, he slept for longer than a snatched hour. The city, which had moved at the speed of rumor and habit, softened around him. The narrative that had started with ridicule became slowly a story of correction. Those who had been quick to laugh were now slower. Some apologized. Others made quiet reparations. A neighbor brought over a bag of groceries. The clerk at the bakery packed an extra crust into the bag without being asked. Small acts gathered like offerings. There was an event Isabella wanted him to attend that was not a press conference, but a small local gathering to honor community protectors. She asked him to be there as something other than a symbol. He agreed. He arrived looking like himself, patched coat pressed into civility, jeans neat, the pen tucked back into his pocket like a quiet promise. When they called his name, he stood and said nothing more than, "I did what anyone would have," and the room refused to let him hide. Sophie visited more often. She and Emily became easier acquaintances and then hangout companions. They traded secrets about silly things, favorite ice cream flavors, what made them scared in the dark. Sophie had stitches across her wrist that would leave a faint line. Emily thought it was a mark like a secret and treated it so. Sophie in turn learned how to braid a ponytail properly and asked shy questions about school lunches. The small things that heal quietly kept happening. One evening, as rain started again, Michael sat at the windowsill and held the broken pen in his hand. There was an old weight in its metal, the memory of hands that had steadied others. He thought about Sarah and the way she had once said that a life wasted on fear was the only kind of death she refused to meet. He had promised her a life for Emily, and the promise had cost him jobs he had liked, a swagger he had once owned, a certain anonymity in middle-of-the-night rooms. He had stayed in the small apartment because it was safe, and because every choice had a child in its center. The pen's engraving caught the light, and he thought about the ease with which strangers had written him out of his story. He had been cast that morning as someone desperate enough to beg for day-old bread. The shorthand was cruel but not untrue. He had been hungry for possibilities, and that was not a shameful thing. To be mistaken for a life one did not live was to be human under a merciless sky. At a small event months later, a young man from the neighborhood who had once recorded the alley video apologized in public, clumsy and earnest. He said, "I called you something I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." It was an awkward moment to thank someone for admitting a lack of imagination. But Michael, who had been shaped by years of being judged, accepted the apology with a shrug. It wasn't a trophy he wanted. It was an invitation to live. Isabella's foundation grew slowly. It focused on creating small programs that helped families living on lean budgets save without shame. Michael oversaw a team of people who taught security and safety with the same restraint he had learned. His job was practical and quiet, rooted in the skill set he had once used to keep others safe. He wrote a curriculum that taught people how to stay visible without being vulnerable. He ran workshops about how to navigate emergency calls without stoking fear. He built a small program that offered free childcare during job searches, not because he was a philanthropist on camera, but because he remembered nights when the horizon had felt too thin. The media still visited on occasion. When they did, he would read their questions like weather, predictable and trite. He learned to answer simply, "I did the right thing." He learned to steer attention away from himself when he could and toward the work. Emily grew into a child who understood complexity in the way all children do when it's introduced gently. She knew not everyone was kind, that some people made quick stories about others for laughs. But she also knew small things, how to braid Sophie's hair, how to share a sandwich, how to write a note and fold it into a thermos. She kept the drawing of 2 stick figures in a place of honor on the fridge. It had a solar system of hearts around it. Years later, in moments when the past would come to him like a scent, rain on pavement, someone speaking in a hurry, he would take the pen from the drawer and twirl it in his fingers. The eagle was worn, the line softened, but it spoke of memory. He would sometimes show it to Emily when she asked. He would tell her, "This is what you carry. It's small, but it tells a story about the person who kept you safe." He never told her the whole of what had existed before. He preserved silence as a shelter when necessary. The city's appetite for quick narratives remained, but in the place where his life had been tied up in a misread morning, something gentler had grown. People began to remember that those they saw might be worn for reasons that didn't mean weakness.
A local newspaper ran a piece about him that spoke not of heroics, but of trade-offs and love. A teacher at Emily's school asked him to speak quietly to a classroom about courage. He accepted, awkward and honest. He put an emphasis on simple acts of bravery, returning a wallet, stopping to help an elderly neighbor, calling for help when it's needed. The broken pen never stopped being functional precisely because it had been broken. It fit into that space where loss and purpose intersected. Once Emily fell off a swing and bit her lip. He held her and mopped her face with a napkin and handed her a small bandage, like a sovereign making a tiny treaty with a bruise. She looked at him solemnly and said, "Daddy, you still fix things."
He smiled, a small gathering of warmth, and felt the old life rearrange itself around new priorities. One slow evening, when the city lowered its voice to a hum and the stars fought with the glow of sodium lights, Michael stood outside the bakery where he'd first asked for day-old bread. The owner, a man who had seen him come in before with crumbs for a child, waved. They had never spoken of that morning. The crust that had been handed over then had not always been about hunger alone. It had been a pragmatic stitch in a day that needed to hold. He thought about the phrase that had become a hook in headlines, and it felt lighter now because it wasn't the only thing he was. He had seen what it meant to be reduced to a single image. He had watched people make up stories about a life they did not know. He had also seen the reverse, the way a single act could reveal something deeper. He had been mistaken for someone else and then recognized for who he was. That experience had become part of him, the way a scar becomes an old map you learn to read. Sophie, now healed in more ways than one, came by one afternoon with a sketchbook for Emily. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, marker caps lined up like soldiers. Isabella dropped off a flyer for a new community program and left with a wave that was more private than public now. Michael packed up 2 sandwiches for a volunteer group he helped coordinate, the pen burning a small circle of light in his pocket. Emily looked at him and asked the question children ask when they are comfortable enough to be curious about their parents. "Did people used to say mean things about you because of your jacket?" He shrugged and said, "Some did." She thought about that and then, with a child's exquisite fairness, said, "But they were wrong." He laughed, and it was not a big laugh. It was a contained sound that wrapped around the room like heat. "Yeah," he said, "they were." When they tucked into bed that night, he took the pen out and laid it on the bedside table next to Emily's lamp. The lamp cast a soft circle over her sleeping face. He thought of everything he had traded and everything he had kept. He thought of bread and Kens and small everyday mercy. The city's louder stories would always be part of the background, but the quiet one, the one about a father making a life, would be the one they lived. In the end, what he learned was not a grand moral, but a practical truth. Being seen matters. Not because the world owes credit for decency, but because recognition can change the kind of choice a person can make. The city had been quick to label and slow to listen. It had turned a moment of defense into a punchline, and then, when pressed by a woman who had the means to speak cleanly, it rewrote itself. He kept the pen because it reminded him that pieces of the past can be used to build something new. It was not about reclaiming a title or settling old accounts.
It was about choosing a life that fit his daughter and his conscience, enough stability to sleep without counting pennies, and enough privacy to let his child be small. He had been mistaken for a man asking for day-old bread, and in the end he had found himself given bread in a different form: security, dignity, a chance to keep doing what he had always done, only with less strain. Some people only needed a little bread. Some only needed to be seen. The city kept turning, but in one small patch of it, a father and his daughter sat by a table with a warm loaf between them, and the world felt for once like a place where choices could be soft and safe.